Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Tillapaugh, and I'm Assistant Professor of Counselor Education at California Lutheran University. I use he, him, his pronouns. And these recordings are a continued series on educational research that I've been completing. And today we have two fantastic scholars whose pieces students of mine have been reading for class. And we are going to follow up on those articles that they have written. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment. But again, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Chris Linder at the University of Georgia, who really inspired these recorded sessions with scholars doing educational research. And thank you, Chris, for continuing to inspire this series. I'm going to go ahead and ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask DL to perhaps go first.
All right, thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, greetings to you all who are watching wherever and whenever you're watching from. My name is Dafina Lazarus Stewart, and Dafina Lazarus is a hyphenated first name. My gender pronouns are ze, them, and zir. I am currently not technically in a position anywhere right now. Although neither my calendar nor my email inboxes would suggest that. But I am moving into a position at Colorado State University as professor and part of the director leadership for the Student Affairs and Higher Education program there at Colorado State. I'm also the senior associate editor for the Journal of College Student Development, and I'm currently a member of the senior scholars group for ACPA. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and where I am and what I'm doing right now. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you.
And I'm Dr. Z. Nicolazzo. The pronouns that I'll be using for today are ze and here, although those are, pliable. Maybe we can talk about that when we discuss positionality. And I'm an assistant professor in the Adult and Higher Education program at Northern Illinois University, also a faculty associate in the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and maybe also pertinent to some of the stuff that maybe we'll talk about today. I'm working with a number of colleagues to kind of spearhead the creation and the work behind the second national symposium on LGBTQ research in higher ed that's taking place at lovely Northern Illinois University in bucolic DeKalb, Illinois, this coming October.
Thank you so much to the both of you for joining today in this conversation. So to give a little bit of framing, this conversation is really wrapped up around an idea that came out of some of the conversations that we were having as a faculty who teach research courses and trying to situate and understand the importance of culturally proficient research and thinking deeply about what it means for researchers to think about their own sense of positionality and doing that through reflexivity, but also thinking broadly about what are the different components that we need to be aware of in educational research around engaging in research that is working towards cultural efficiency. And so I'm excited to have you both join for this conversation today and appreciate the insights you're going to be sharing. The first question that I wanted to sort of ask the both of you is, when you think about educational research, what does it mean for researchers to be cognizant of the ways their identities play a role in understanding their work? And what's been fundamental to your own practice as a researcher in thinking about your own identities and the ways that informs your work? And so maybe Z, if you don't mind going first, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm fine going first. I was hoping that DL would answer all the questions first, and then I could just be like, yeah, whatever Z said, because Z is real smart. So this is what happens when you Zoom with friends. So I think in terms of, the the importance of identities, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but and I think DL will as well. When we think about research, and I'll just say when we think about all types of educational research, including quantitative and mixed methods research, we come to that research through ourselves and through our lived experiences, right? And so, so we approach research through our identities, and that then means that they're super important to how we understand, analyze, and make meaning of that kind of raw data. It also influences the way that we ask questions, what questions we ask, what questions we don't ask, and what silences may exist in our research. And so for me, identities are the very bedrock of not only just the way that we make meaning of our research, but the research that we seek to understand in the first place. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Thank you.
You know, I really think I'm just doing an and as an add-on to what Z has already enunciated. For me, I think that for educational research, being really keenly aware of one's own identity is especially important, because education itself, is an identity project, both in its goals and in its pedagogy. Education is first about who the subject is, who the learner is, and most importantly, perhaps, particularly in K through 12 education, who the teacher is, right? And so, and we can see this in higher education research from some of our earliest educational philosophers that we tend to draw on. We think about Cardinal Newman and even Plato, long before Newman, and others, that center the development of the person, and in a particular type of person, right, to show up in the world in particular types of ways. That's all about identity, right? And so education itself is an identity project. I think for me, in my own development and education in the field, this was brought most clearly into view for me through reading the work of such Black educational scholars as Anna Julia Cooper and W.B. Du Bois, as well as others who saw in education the possibility of both personal and social liberty for those descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. During my dissertation research, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and also Wendy Luttrell were others who played key roles in encouraging me through their writing to bring my own identity into the forefront, even as I attempted to center my study on other people's identities. So remembering who I was and how I came into that project was something that their work encouraged me to do, because that's what they were doing in their work. Even though, other than Wendy Luttrell, the others, Hooks, Lorde, were not writing. We're not social scientists of education, right? But in the way that they did their work and the way they did their praxis, who they was always evident in that. And for me, that was really encouraging. So,
thank you. That's great. DL, continuing sort of the piece of sort of the piece that we're reading in our class, at least, is your researcher as instrument piece, which for me was totally important in thinking about my own work around positionality, the shift that changes over time. And so I was hoping that you could just talk a little bit about what sort of drew you to sort of writing that piece, and what was important to you sort of as larger takeaways of sort of that particular manuscript or piece that you were writing.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to talk more about that. And it's a piece that, quite honestly, when I wrote and it got accepted and was published, I really didn't expect it to do a lot in terms of triggering conversations or get talked about or get referenced. And I've been pleasantly, obviously, surprised that I was like dead wrong about that. It actually seems to be one of the pieces that people ask me about the most and talk to me about the most. So I'm really encouraged by that. And it makes me glad that I wrote it, it was pretty vulnerable for me to do that, because I was worried that the response would be, like, even from reviewers, that the response would be, oh, now we're just going to cast doubt on, like, your entire dissertation research. Because I wrote this pretty early in my career. I mean, it didn't get published until 2010, but this piece had been in formation for about 5 years prior to that. And so by the time it came out, yes, I had just gotten tenure and promotion to associate, but as I started working, like I said, when I started working on it, it's still very, very early in my career. And just to give a little context around it, I'd done my dissertation research on how Black and African American students understood the ways that multiple facets of their social identity, so race, gender, class, sexuality, etc., informed each other and shaped how they understood themselves and the world around them, as well as what role spirituality played in all that. So I collected that data in 2000 with students who had entered college between 1996 and 1998. Following that, I became curious about how pervasive my findings from that study were, partly because of some critiques I had gotten from either reviewers or, people. I remember trying to put a book proposal out and having a publisher not even bother to encourage me to develop it into a full manuscript proposal, because he was like, it's 5 students at one institution, so who cares? You're not really saying anything. So that was 2000. That happened in 2000, 2001. I think things have changed a bit since then, fortunately. And but at the time, so that's the kind of feedback I got. And so I became curious about sort of that pervasiveness, so is that criticism really valid? These were just 5 students at one institution, and you really can't say anything bigger from that. And so I replicated the study. Imagine that. And this is something that even as I taught, I think about Jocelson's research and some other folks, where even as we write about that research now, one of the things we say is that no one ever replicated that. Jocelyson never really replicated it herself. We look at women's ways of knowing. There really hasn't been a replication of that study since then. And so I decided, well, let me replicate my own work. And so a larger group of students, 13, across 3 different institutions, one predominantly white and public, the other 2 both historically Black, one private, one public. And so I was also trying to play with whether institutional type and student demographics would make any difference, okay? Because the dissertation research was done with students at a private, predominantly white liberal arts college. So of course, in the meantime, I had continued to read about intersectionality, and of course, Jones and Avis, and their work was continuing to develop and manifest around multiple identities, and how that was, the RMMDI, and all that had been out at that point. And so both of those pieces of literatures were carried with me into the second study. Those data were very different, as I discussed in that article. And at first, what's interesting, of course, people, you wouldn't know this, but at first I wrote it up as a generational difference, because the students in the second study were interviewed in about, I think, 2003 or 4, and so had entered college between 1999 and 2001. So I was thinking initially, well, maybe those millennial cuspers in the first study were a different cohort than the early millennials in the second. That, of course, didn't carry water with the reviewers. The first time I submitted it to the first journal. So this manuscript, part of the reason why it took so long to come out, didn't come out till 2010, was because it went through 2 different journals, review processes, actually 3 different journals review processes. When I reread the data, reviewed their feedback from the second journal, that actually had invited a revise and resubmit. one of them had actually suggested the difference I was seeing had more to do with me than with the students. And so I did some more reading, and I thought a little bit deeper. There was another reviewer who said that they didn't think the journal I had submitted to was the right journal for it. And so I actually declined the R&R with that journal. So heads up note to folks who may be watching this and going, oh my God, you denied an R&R. Yes, I did. And the article still got published. You don't have to accept every R&R. Think about the feedback, think about audience, think about where you want to go. And so I decided to take it to a different journal. Not because the journal I was at wouldn't have been receptive, but in thinking about the feedback I got, and was like, well, maybe this really isn't the right journal for what it is I want to do. Because as I thought more deeply, I realized, yeah, this is actually more about me than about the students and their development and what was happening there. So the second journal I took it to was not the right place. So I completely rewrote the manuscript and centered fallibilism, that philosophical idea that not just uncertainty, but also flaws are always present. My own growth and my own growth as a researcher. And so when I looked back, I noticed I had phrased the questions in the interviews slightly differently, had interpreted the data slightly differently. And those slight differences mattered, as it was about bringing a much more mature and refined intersectional perspective into the analysis and into the study in the first place. So that was important to me, to acknowledge that researchers do grow and develop. Of course, there were only 5 years between the two studies, the data collection for the two studies, but I think significant growth can happen even in that shorter period. I mean, that's what we claim about college, right? 4, 5, 6 years, significant growth happens. So I think as educators and as researchers, we get caught up in the temptation that research is fixed and final, even when it isn't. Even old school scientific method acknowledges fallibilism, actually, but it usually isn't acknowledged, even particularly in popular discourse about scientific knowledge. And so it was really important for me to go out there and say, these data look different because I changed and my understanding matured. And so we really need to continue to revisit stuff we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, with a different lens, with a different understanding, even in our own work, let alone as we are understanding the work of other researchers and scholars, And so I think particularly in student affairs and when we look at theory, I know Z and I have been in conversation with others on Twitter about this even relatively recently. We have tended to hold really fast and dear to the canon of student development theory without really thinking about what perspectives, what epistemological viewpoints, what assumptions are baked into that research that no longer work or shouldn't work anymore 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years later in some of these cases. And so that's what prompted it, and really wanting to push us to be more vulnerable about ourselves and our findings, to be a lot more humble about our data and our interpretations, and be willing to say, you know what, I think I got something a little off, or this wasn't really as good as it could have been because I had a less mature or less sophisticated understanding of these issues at the time that I first did this than I do now. So if I were to do this again, this is how this would look different. I think we really need to have those kinds of conversations and be open about them, both in our written work, in our classrooms, and particularly in our practice. So.
Thank you. That's great. I resonate with a lot of that, right? Just thinking about even the chapter that Z and I wrote, we wrote it a few years ago now, I think 3 years ago, in our living room up in Maine, over a weekend. And just thinking, if I had to rewrite that chapter now, I know my part would be significantly different. I think because of just the amount of growth that I've made personally in thinking more critically. I'm not a constructivist anymore, although I claim that in my chapter, right? I would say I'm still a constructivist, but I'm a critical constructivist now. So that I just resonate with that piece, and I'm so pleased that my students get to read and learn from you, DL. So thank you for that. Z, as we were writing that piece that I just alluded to, I remember that we were having some really important conversations about the ways that epistemologies really inform and shape the ways in which we look at our work. And so I'm hoping that you might be able to discuss what that means to you from that vantage point.
Yeah, and I'm going to try and make some connections into what DL was talking about too, because I think it's going to be really, I think this is like, there's more in conversation kind of stuff that we can have, right? Rather than thinking about these as discrete pieces. Right. So were we to go back and rewrite that piece, right? Like, I think what I would want to do is make it more explicit that chapter is less of a, let me string my identities together with commas, right? To kind of use like Judith Butler's critique of identity-based kind of work, which is oftentimes what we see in terms of positionality, right? Like, as a reviewer for journals, when I read a positionality statement, often what I hear is, well, I am identity, comma, identity, comma, identity, comma, right? And my response is that actually tells me nothing about how you come to your work or how you come to know what it is that your data are suggesting, right? So what I would want to do is, and I think this was in the background, but not the foreground, I would want to amplify the fact that our chapter is actually an invitation, right? Our chapter is an invitation to constantly go back and rethink how it is we come to know what our values are and how those values actually shape the research process on the front end, right? And so in thinking through what DL is talking about, and in particular this notion of fallibility and fallibilism, I was really, all of a sudden I perked up around Eli Clare, who's a disability studies poet and activist. And Eli Clare has written about this notion of cruising justice. And immediately I thought about this idea of cruising doubt, right? Like that we should, and you know, so if I insert doubt into Clare's work where he's written justice, his language would sound like this. I want us to cruise doubt, to flirt with it, take it home with us, nurture and feed it, even though sometimes it will be demanding and uncomfortable and ask us to change. Clearly, I'm not talking about a simple one-night stand, but a commitment for the long haul, right? And so I think this idea of like cruising doubt and about like cruising our identities and who we are and how those identities shape how we come to know is a process that is not a one-night stand, but it's a commitment for the long haul. We need to keep on going back and revisiting it, right? So you said, Dan, like, I wouldn't consider myself a constructivist anymore, right? Like, I think there are many things that have changed about me and how I understand my own gender and my own, right, like the way that I think about truth and values and knowledge, the way that I've come into my own disability identity that are very different than they were, I think probably 4 years ago, right, is when we actually wrote that piece. And so I would want to shift it a little bit more to really foreground this as an invitation to constantly go back and think about how we as research vessels, to use DL's kind of language in the researcher as instrument piece, always already shape the way that we come to knowledge, right? Even for people that want to suggest that knowledge is objective, they're always already shaping the way that we come to it, right? Whether it's the way that we frame questions, the way that we make meaning of research, the analysis that we choose to do. So I find it to be quite literally, I hate to be a kind of broken record, but I do find it to be the bedrock of educational research, is like what's happening on the front end, when oftentimes we think about research as something that we do after we collect data, right? We analyze it on the back end. But there's all this stuff on the front end, which I think was the point behind the chapter name, right? The backwards thinking element of it. So.
That's great. I mean, I definitely, I mean, yeah, I love that. I love that, cruising doubt, and sort of thinking more about these pieces of just how much, again, going back to DL's statement earliest about education itself as an identity project, right? And the ways in which we are look at our own identities, how that then shapes the ways that we look at data that we might be engaging with, how we are asking these questions in real ways that sort of then also have insight to our sort of epistemological sort of lenses, the ways that we're sort of engaging in the work, and it all sort of fuses together in really important ways.
Well, and too, I just want to point this out real quickly. Like, for those folks who don't know DL or haven't read DL's work, like, DL is incredibly precise with the language that Z uses. And so the word project, I think, is really important to pick up on, right? Like, a project suggests, well, I wouldn't say suggest, it indicates, right, something that is always ongoing, that's always open to revision, and that is both a process and a product, right? And so, Tanya Tchaikovsky talks about this restless reflexive return, and we talk about this as educators, right? The education is an iterative process, right? We continue to loop back. And so I think the word project is so insightful when we think about research itself, right? It is a project even after we get something published, right?
Totally. Absolutely. Thank you. One of the things, and you both have alluded to it in different ways through some of your answers, but again, some of my students have heard my soapbox, that I feel very much that in qualitative research, particularly, there is more of a heightened awareness of the need of understanding positionality and reflexivity, and then yet in more quantitative approaches, there is zero discussion around, often, in positionality and reflexivity, and how your data is informed. And so I'm just curious, because I'm wanting to understand further, if you have any insights across those different approaches of research, why researchers' identities either get played up or played down in particular ways. And I'm just, whoever would like to maybe start us off on this would be great.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in. I would say that it's that the beginning of that answer is prior to the methodology, that it's the epistemology, right? And those assumptions about ontology even, and so what the nature of reality is, as well as what knowledge is and how it's constructed, that matters the most, and whether a particular methodology either invites or discourages that acknowledgement and mobilization of a researcher's identities in a study. Particularly how it treats objectivity and bias, how we come to know, the way that one's epistemology answers those questions is going to lead you to a certain methodology, right? And I think it's really important to start the conversation there instead of making it a qual distinction, because it is possible, as one of my soapboxes, that students are, that my qualitative research students at BGSU got used to hearing me get on about, is that you can do qualitative research from post-positivist paradigms, epistemological paradigms. People do it all the time. And so how you approach the study is what matters. The nature of reality and the nature of knowledge, probably particularly those two pieces, so your ontological and epistemological perspectives matter. Now, of course, typically quantitative research, so survey-based research and whatnot, hierarchical linear modeling and regression and all of those things are based in some presumptions about what reality is and what knowledge is that are post-positivist or even positivist, right? Typically, but not exclusively. So, I think about critical quantitative work and some of the things that I've seen done from, I think Francis Stage edited a really neat little New Directions in institutional research, I think it is, monograph on critical quantitative research that talks about the centering of identity and who we are as researchers and how we take that into the project. And so if you're going to come at something from a critical epistemological, ontological paradigm, you must bring in self, I think, in a lot of ways. And so as you think about what questions you're asking and why you're asking them, how you form a survey item, all of those kinds of things. So it's possible. So for me, it's a little, it goes beyond the quant qual, even though typically that's how it plays out, right? But a more positivist phenomenology or grounded theory study is not necessarily going to be any more prone to bringing in the researchers' identities than your typical research study. So
I appreciate that. It's an important naming for me that it goes beyond just sort of quant versus qual, for sure.
Well, and I think what DL is pointing out is that it's paradigmatic, right? Like that that there are lots of different things that we need to think through when we think about what type of research we do. The thing that I will say, and I'd be curious to hear from the both of you about what you think about this. I'm pretty sure that we've all had these conversations before, but the notion of critical quantitative work I find so intensely fascinating, right? Because there are, I would argue that there are structural quagmires that come up in the study design element, right? So you can have certain paradigmatic assumptions and beliefs, right? That oftentimes have difficulty in the actual creation of, right, study design and instruments. So if you have so let's use my work, for example, right? I have some beliefs around the flexibility and the flexibility of gender, right? And the inability to strictly codify gender in different kinds of ways. But if we're thinking about quantitative research, right, we need to create survey instruments, right, that have specific items in them that help to codify, right, these experiences and identities. And one could very easily say, well, we'll just make it an open text field and someone can type in their response, right? But then my question is, so what are you going to do with all these different responses? Let's say that you have 8 participants or 8 respondents, right, who submit answers, and there are 12 different genders that they put in there, right? How are you going to deal with that? And oftentimes what happens, often not always, right, is that people collapse those, right? And so again, right, there are some things around study design, there are some things around analysis, right, that tend to be structural challenges for someone with critical paradigmatic leanings and critical desires around data analysis. Not suggesting it can't happen, right? But I think that there are some tricky bits, right, when we talk about what that looks like. Not to say that doesn't happen with qualitative research, right? I think we all know lots of folks who say that they're critical qualitative researchers who are also maybe not doing that paradigm justice. So So yeah, I mean, for me, when I think about educational research, I think about, I've often been taught and trained to think about this as you have lots of different puzzle pieces, and all those puzzle pieces should really fit together and should work and make sense in terms of paradigm, epistemology, ontology, axiology, right? Some of those things that DL was talking about previously. With your research question, with your study design, then with analysis, and also with then the way that you display, right, your findings, right? So it's not just about analysis, but it's also about how do you write about this, how do you present, and going back to DL's point about the researcher's instrument piece, where you decide to present your research as well, right? All of those are political choices that I think really need to make sense and need to be in alignment with your overall project.
If I may jump in and just respond to Z's initial quandary there, that I acknowledge and would perhaps push back and say what you're articulating about a perspective on gender isn't necessarily critical, but is rather post-structural perspective on gender. And so I don't think we would see a post-structural quantitative methodology, because I don't think that there's any way to reconcile the exact structural challenge that you named at all. But for me, I think that articulation of gender as something that's fluid and not stable, and is that there are as many genders, I think about Alokbade Menon's, there's as many genders as there are people on the planet, is at all compatible with quantitative survey-based methodology at all, because you have to do the math. You have to be able to do the math. And in order to do the math, you've got to do some collapsing and something, right? And so that to me is a different paradigm than a critical, necessarily, like a pure critical paradigm doesn't necessarily carry that assumption about gender or race or any other social identity construct, that it's fluid and not stable and whatnot. At least most commonly, you know. And so that's where I think there's a really neat Stage's first chapter, like the intro piece, maybe I guess they call it the editor's notes or whatever, in the monograph, where she lays out the ways that critical theory and quantitative methodology are compatible, like why they're able to be compatible, I think illustrates this point, you know, that there are some ways that a pure critical reading of identity and whatnot does allow for the use of quantitative methodology, particularly in a survey, in survey methodology, in a way that post-structural, postmodern, deconstructionist, nah, fam, you're not gonna see that. That's not gonna work, right? So, absolutely, and that alignment matters. You know, I wouldn't do a survey-based study with my current understanding of how gender works and what gender is, because I couldn't align it. I wouldn't be able to align it at all, you know. But I think there are perhaps some other ways, other kinds of topics where critical quant could still be very useful, you know, college choice models, for instance, or something like that, you know. So maybe not identity, particularly if it's a more, not just critical, but post-structural understanding of identity. I wouldn't do survey, and I don't think critical quant could work, but I think there are some other topics and some other projects where it could. So it matters what the topic is, right? It matters what the topic is and how you understand the topic itself.
Yeah, and I think that component piece is what's really important, right? Like we need to also realize that the limitations are that there are certain limitations, and if we can't address the topic that we want to address using a particular type of method, then we need to accept that and maybe then figure out something else, or how can we sort of achieve what we want with some of that. But again, identity is playing through some of that, I think, too, if that makes any sense.
Well, I think it speaks to, right, like what's in the driving seat of the research, right? Like is the driver the type of study design you want to have? Because if it is, it shouldn't be, right? Or is it the question that you want to ask, right? Is it the knowledge that you want to find out and to produce, right, and co-produce? Like that to me seems to be the important component, right? And I think that what DL is really articulating is that you need to really have a good think about what you believe and why you believe it, right? Because I think that Z is clearly right, because like literally everything that DL says is yes. Like, yeah, there are some post-structural and right, like some post-structural, heavily post-structural leanings to that comment that I made around gender, right? And right, there are also some deeply critical aspects of it too, because the reality is that the criticality of it comes into a critique around binary notions of gender, right? And so I think there becomes this, like all of these things that we're talking about really leak, and we need to think about what is it that we're trying to get at, and what device, what kind of research is actually best able to get us where we need and want to go, right? We can ask any kind of question through almost any kind of study design, but the knowledge is going to change and our epistemologies would be very different too, right? So, yeah.
Well, and so I want to go back, because earlier in the conversation, Z, you mentioned sort of positionality statements in research manuscripts, and often they are identity, comma, identity, comma, identity, comma, without a lot of discussion about reflexivity. And I think that sometimes this is, I remember even going back to my own first research project and having to think through reflexivity and my positionality. And it was a little confusing for me of like, what should I be talking about here? And I could go on for like pages, but how do I then like actually create something that is meaningful and that demonstrates that there has been some forethought in terms of identity and the work that I've done here. And so could you both maybe describe some ways that you've made meaning about your positionality as you engage through the research projects, and what's worked well for you in terms of sort of demonstrating or writing up sort of that reflexivity statement or positionality statement? And again, whoever would like to start us off, it would be great.
I can start with just a couple of real quick comments. So I've learned a lot, I think, about positionality statements from Dr. Michael Denton, who's a faculty member at the University of South Florida. I had the pleasure of learning alongside Michael. We're both products of the Miami University doctoral program. And Michael was a year ahead of me. He's a post-structuralist thinker and did his research alongside men who have sex with men and are HIV positive. And he was getting some feedback from his committee during his comps process that they wanted more of a positionality statement in his research. And he wrote this really, what I think is a beautifully crafted positionality statement where he asks the question, of his reader, how does your reading change if you know whether or not I'm pause, right? And he really is kind of, I think, needling readers in a really important way to say, like, what about this is important for you? How is me naming an identity somehow telling you whether I'm an authority or whether the research is good, right? And so through this process and through these conversations that we had when he was comping, I really grew into an understanding of like, I want to use positionality statements to let readers know what is my relationship to the research? Not let me tell you an identity, right? But how is it that identity brought me to this research, and why why is that important? Why is my relationship to the research itself unique, important, curious, right? Like, so that's the way that I've used positionality statements. And it's hard sometimes, right? Because like these things shift and change over time, and it takes time to get something through the publication process. So sometimes by the time we actually get something out in print, right? Like, and for example, right? Like my book actually got into print fairly fast, but even in my book, I talk about not having a disability, which now I've come into my own disability identity, right? Like there's something about the static nature of pages that sometimes can be difficult. And so what I'm more interested in is like that relationship, the relationality of it, I guess.
So what Z said, I mean, you know, Z's been pumping me up this whole conversation and not acknowledging her own brilliance, because I really think that what Z just articulated is really the crux of what I was saying. You know, for me, I noted to myself, it's about asking myself the question, what difference is my difference making? Which is that relationality piece. You know, what difference does it make to me of who I am coming into this study and why I chose this topic? So as Z mentioned earlier, the research project begins from the time you choose a topic. It doesn't begin when you begin analyzing data. And so, you know, what is it about me that brought me to this topic in this way? And how is that continuing to shape the decisions that I'm making? Like Z, you know, particularly in my role of JCSD, I read manuscripts all the time where I'm just like, you've told me nothing. You've written 2 pages on researcher positionality, and I haven't learned a thing about why all of these identity, and it has anything to do with what you did in this study. And that's what I need to know. I think a really influential scholar for me in shaping my understanding of this has been Patricia Hill Collins' writing on being an outsider within. Because I think what happens what I think happens often, not all the time, but often, particularly with researchers who have very salient commitments to minoritized or marginalized aspects of our identities, is that we fixate on those pieces and we ignore the privileges that we also bring into the project, and that shape how we understand the topic, how we understand our participants, and how we relate to them, and then what we do with the data and implications and all of that, right? And so over time, for me, it's become more and more and more important to acknowledge how my assumptions about education, my move into a very privileged class status and professional status, away from a working class upbringing, has influenced my approach to the issues that I want to study. I'm not the same person I was when I was completing my dissertation. And so my reflexivity about my positionality has had to become much more nuanced in acknowledging the ways that privilege is shaping how I understand and how I move through the world. The ways that I can deflect certain, sometimes, not all the times, and only certain attacks, you know, against the marginalized and minoritized aspects of my identity through privileged class and education and professional status, right? That matters. And so how I understand and what assumptions I make, the way that, you know, and one of the things I want to do is a study about college choice for young people who are who have minoritized identities around sexuality and gender. Well, the way I frame that study and the assumptions that I make and who I include and where I go for respondents, right, can easily be deformed and formed by the fact that I am a full professor co-director of student affairs and higher ed program, that I have a child who was going to college, who went through a very traditional educational trajectory to get there, is going to a relatively nowadays elite institution. All of that can deform, malform, form how I approach that study. And so needing to be truly critical about that has become more important than it would have been probably 20 years ago, where I may have approached that very differently. And still, even 20 years ago, I mean, part of my own educational trajectory has a lot of privilege. Well, I've been able to access a very privileged educational trajectory, not because I came from a privileged socioeconomic background. I don't, but was still able to access that. And so again, that in and of itself, it has got to be present. And that it's more important for me to talk about that and how that shapes my relationship to the topic than the fact that Black, was first generation in college, and all these things that I could use to manipulate the reader into thinking that I have a certain type of relationship to the study that I actually don't have, right? Because I think what Z talked about in terms of Michael Denton's work and that question, you know, what difference does this make for the reader, is really, really important, right? And the ways that positionality statements have been used as political projects in and of themselves to undermine the authority of people who are with minoritized identities, who are doing research with minoritized participants, okay, as well as elevate the supposed greater authority of those who don't have that, which I think, you know, kind of plays into your next question. So I don't want to get ahead of you there, but yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing.
Well, and I would say too that this is some of the reason why we can't have nice things as educational researchers, right? Is like sometimes people will say that folks who write positionality statements are engaging in a form of narcissism, right? That we go, as DL mentioned, on and on for 2 pages about ourselves, and it doesn't really actually tell us anything about how we get to the research. And for me, it's a missed opportunity. And when I review pieces, I often will write that, like, you've missed an opportunity to talk about something really important to the research process, and instead have written it in a way that has totally separated yourself from your research and just talked about, well, this is who I am, and let me talk about myself a little bit, right? And so I kind of joke around like, oh, that's why we can't have nice things. But in all reality, right, like I think we've been socialized in certain ways, just like in large part, right, quantitative researchers have been socialized to think of themselves as separate from knowledge based on the assumption, right, the ontological and epistemological assumptions that there are capital T truths that are objective and a priori, right? And so yeah, I want us to move towards a land where we can have nice things again, right? And part of that means rethinking our own positionality statements.
And that's helpful. And hopefully all of my students will start rethinking about their positionality statements down the line.
Let's have nice things, students.
Let's. So, you know, this next question is, I think, an important one, because we've started in my class to sort of identify some projects that they may be interested in sort of putting into motion for a thesis or things down the line. And so, you know, let's say that a master's student was interested in exploring a project that was personally interesting to them, but that it was focused on a population that they themselves were not a part of. What are some important things that you might suggest to those students when thinking about their preparation for launching both data collection and analysis, and maybe even prior to data collection, like just thinking about the project in general? And just some initial thoughts. Whoever would like to start. Yeah.
I see Z pointing at me. I think some really deep, hard work on the why is number one. Okay, why do you want to do this? what do you think doing this is going to do for you? Okay. And what is it, how are you positioning yourself in relationship to the topic and to your potential participants? Okay. That why is really, really, really important. I mean, we have seen some incredibly awful examples out of not just educational research, but anthropology, I think particularly, of sort of missionary complexes and the ways that, I mean, just horrible abuses have come in because of people's why, and really misplaced savior complexes and, like I said, missionary complexes around the topic and being a voice for. I have had to disrupt so many students who have said, well, I want to be a voice for, and I'm like, no, because how about they have their own voice? You can't be a voice for anybody. This is not a puppet show, right? And so what's your why? I think is really, really critical, and really humbling yourself. And if your why is twisted, you need to put it down, okay, and choose something else. We have, so, and the why, and so, yeah, so we often are tempted, I'm going to try to refrain from getting on a soapbox here, but we're often tempted to put the spotlight and the microscope on minoritized populations instead of turning that microscope on those who have been assigned privilege and those who have dominance in society. We need much more work, quality, empirical work on the way that dominance works and shows up in folks and through folks and for folks. So do that work, shoot. Leave the rest of us alone. But but if you insist and move in this direction, I would also suggest being really intentional about centering work written by members of that group in their review of the literature, and sort of how you come to understand this topic and this issue, really making sure it is informed by people who are living it. Okay, and who come out of that experience, which might mean needing to leave the formal, scholarly, academic literature, because in some of these topics that hasn't gotten into those journals yet. Okay, and so really thinking and being really, not thinking, but really being intentional about centering work written by members of that group, and allowing that to inform your methodology. You know, and finally, in such cases, choosing a methodology that centers the voices and interpretations of the participants is key, because it becomes really, really easy to insert your own dominant ideologies and frameworks otherwise. You know, so what's the methodology you're using that will allow you to center and amplify the voices and interpretations of the participants themselves? Okay, not yours, but theirs. Okay, so that you can displace and do, you know, have some assistance in terms of how you structure the project and displacing your own dominance. Because I really do think it's really easy for those things to slip in, because we've been so inundated and socialized into thinking about the world and certain topics and certain groups of people in very particular ways. So I'll stop there and let Z.
Yes. And more, yes, right? Like I kept on thinking about, you know, you asked this question of the why, right? And I kept on thinking about DL, one of our good friends, Lee Patel's signature lines in her email. And it's the quote from the Aboriginal activist groups in Queensland, Australia. And it says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together, right? So as someone who, and Dan and DL, you both know this, but for the students watching, as someone who is currently working on a fellowship proposal to do work alongside of trans women, and particularly trans women of color, right? Not a trans woman of color, right? The why question is really important to me, right? And in a field like education that's highly conservative, I know it might be hard for some folks to believe, but highly conservative, what often happens is that identities and experiences get commodified by people to further their own careers, right? So to quite literally use trans women of color to further my own career is a violent practice. I think we just need to name it what it is. It's violence, right? And for marginalized populations, particularly trans women of color who are already on the margins of the margins, as Steve Mobley Jr. would say, right? We need to be really mindful about what is our why and what's the purpose of us doing work alongside of populations. I also want to give a shout out to Sarah Ahmed, who talks about citational practice as a political tool. So if you're about a population, right, like, and I think this is a running theme of this conversation, you better be about it all through your research process, right? It's not just about your participant pool or your respondents or your interlocutors or however you kind of talk about the folks that you're doing work with. It's about centering these people through the entire process from soup to nuts, right? So citational practice matters. Who we cite is political, and how we resist the pushback that you're going to get from reviewers should you put this or submit this to a journal is also super important, right? Because you're always going to have that reviewer too, who's like, well, these aren't academic sources. You need more academic sources to cite this shit, right? To Dan's students, I swear, it's a form of feminist pedagogy for me. So they're always going to say that, right? And you need to be able to push back and say, no, we shouldn't have to use purely academic scholarly citations. And also now we have one because Sarah Ahmed is amazing, right? So I think that those things really matter. And also, I will say this, big ups to Peter Magolda for doing some of that researching up that DL was talking about, right? Like, and he makes this call, particularly in a piece that he wrote for Anthropology and Education Quarterly, that we should be doing more research on privileged populations and really deconstructing what that looks like. Also, Nolan Cabrera's work on whiteness and white privilege is just fucking brilliant. I mean, if folks haven't read his work, that's the way you do critical research with privileged populations, right? He had a piece in JCSD in 2014 about white racial joking, and just had a piece published in the NCORE journal, really kind of digging into Peggy McIntosh's notion of white privilege and moving us to a place where we actually are talking about white immunity now, which I think is an important turn. So yeah, just giving some credit where it's due.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Just to wrap up, are there any pieces of advice that you would give folks to just continue to think about or read or sort of invest in some time and thought around these issues of working towards research that is moving towards culturally proficient research and thinking deeply about oneself and areas of their interest?
So I'll just share a couple of real quick things. DL's comment about the identities that we often think about, I find to be really instructive, and I think that we can use that as an invitation to focus on identities that might be really uncomfortable for us. And by that, I mean identities where we experience lots of privilege. For me, this means reading outside of our field. And so in particular, right, I've been thinking a lot lately in the past 6 or so months about what it means for me to be heavily invested in the project of colonization, and what it means for me to be a settler colonial person, and how I need to really think about what that means and how it literally seeps into every single thing that I do, right? You know, even to the point, right, I just purchased a house, right? Like, and I was even thinking about, like, is it more colonizing to own property or to rent, right? And the reality is that it's embedded in everything that we do, right? Around like owning property, and in terms of research, like owning research, right? We put our names onto research, we stake flags into research, and so I think that for me, it's been really important to have a good think about colonization and particularly from Indigenous perspective and particularly from Indigenous women's perspectives. I also think that we probably should be, just reading outside of our field, right? Read stuff that's in disability studies, read stuff that's in colonial studies, post-colonial studies, right? And be thinking from dominant identities, right? I think a lot about, right, whiteness and racialization and some of these perspectives as well. So dare I use Sheryl Sandberg's notion of like leaning in, but like lean in hard to your dominant identities. And I went there, friends. I said that. Lean in hard to those and think about what that means for you in terms of your epistemology, ontology, axiology, and your process as a researcher.
I think I definitely want to echo these recommendations to spend a lot of time reading outside higher ed literature. Not because there isn't good work being done in higher ed, but because higher ed is first and foremost a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary field in its roots and foundation. And we do ourselves a disservice when we get to be navel gazing about higher ed literature. It's really not interdisciplinary enough. Z and I are currently working on a manuscript together right now, and we got feedback from reviewers. And we were both, I think Z is the one who enunciated this specifically, but I was also pleasantly surprised at the push to be more interdisciplinary. It's like, yes. I think it is also worthy to note that the journal we're working with right now is not a higher ed journal. But that's crucial. I think the other thing, in addition to all of what Z has named in terms of reading, is spending time writing about yourself for yourself. And so whatever that looks like for you, people's journaling practices are very different. I have a very inconsistent relationship with journaling myself. I'm usually driven to journal by life crises more than anything, than it being a consistent daily practice. But I also recognize, different what I think people call technically micro-blogging platforms like Twitter or Facebook and Instagram. It's also being spaces where we can do that kind of very intentional self-reflection in public, even sometimes, which can open us up to feedback and response, which I think can be useful, and is also dangerous depending on who we are. So we know that Twitter is a very violent and abusive space for Black women in particular, and other women of color. And so everything doesn't always have to be public, but I think spending time with ourselves is important. And for me, it's because I'm a person who's very devoted to writing. Writing helps me think. Okay. And so if writing doesn't help you think, then use the thing that helps you think. Whatever. So that's really what I'm suggesting. More than writing is the practice of using whatever it is that helps you think about yourself in very concrete, particular, tangible ways, consistently to think about yourself. And particularly before you enter into a project, before you enter into a book or an article or reading that Z is suggesting, any of those pieces, take some time as you're reading, before you read, as you read, after you read, to think about you, right? And how you're entering that work. One of the things that assignments I had designed a while back for a class were these reflection papers that were titled, Where and How I Enter. And it was informed by some reading I had done, and now the author's name is flown out of my head. But this idea of really thinking particularly about where and how I enter is important, into a reading, into a research project, into a classroom, where and how am I entering that space? And how is that setting me up to deal with the challenges that are inevitably going to come, the pushback, the doubt that will creep in, how I'm going to relate to other people in that space, whether those other people are fellow students, my instructor, or my co-laborers in my research project. Those I think it's real. I think that's really important, and it's been something that has been very important for me, I think, in my work over the last approaching couple decades. That's weird to say that, but that's okay.
Oh, why you gotta be so old?
Oh my goodness.
We should all be so lucky to be in the field for decades, DL. So, yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you both. This conversation over the last hour or so has really made me think a lot about different aspects of these topics. And I took down some notes of things that I wanted to sort of think further about and reflect on. So I know that the students and folks who will watch this video hopefully will have their own takeaways and their own reflective moments. So thank you for sharing your insights and the valuable knowledge that you contribute to our collective field. So thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's been wonderful.
Totally.
I always learn when I talk with Z.
Absolutely.
Because these
I learn when I listen to the two of you, so this has been great. Mutual Admiration Club.
Thank you.